Middle Podcast, the podcast dedicated to the music, movies, and culture of Generation X.
What is up, slackers, and welcome back to another episode of the Stuck in the Middle podcast. I am your host, Jason Eck, and this is the podcast dedicated to the music, movie, and culture of Generation X. And we're going to jump right into it this week. A couple of weeks ago, Carlos was on the show, and we were discussing our senior year of high school. That would have been 1991 to 1992. And many of the bands that we mentioned were definitely on the harder side for the most part. Heavy metal, hard rock, grunge, if you will. That was really the stuff that when we were out, and hip hop too. I don't want to forget that. So those are the things that we listen to when we're out on a night in our hometown where there's really nothing else to do, and I'm sure all of you can relate to this. You just get into somebody's car and you just go cruising for the night. And maybe you're going from place to place, house to house, parking lot to parking lot, just in search of a good time. Maybe meet a girl, maybe just hang out. Regardless, one of the records that came out in this kind of almost mythical time period where these tremendous records came out back to back to back, there was an existing band that had been around basically longer for the most part than just about any of the bands that we talked about. And they were coming out of Ireland. And at this point in time, it's hard to say if they're one of the most beloved bands or one of the most hated bands of all time, or maybe both, kind of all at the same time. Of course, I'm talking about U2. And there was an album that came out in 1991 by the name of Achtung Baby. Now, we're actually going to circle back to Achtung Baby in just a little bit. I'm going to give you my journey with this particular band. Because this whole notion of most loved, most hated, part of what got this in my head was this meme that's been going around, basically talking about a study was done that no one actually liked U2, and were just too afraid to say it because everyone else did. Now, whether that's true or not is irrelevant. There is definitely that perception of the band. Now, for me, I relate to this. So when I was much younger, so U2's first album that came over stateside, I don't even think Boy made it initially to the States. Maybe it did. I seem to recall only hearing about them. Yeah, because we shouldn't even get into any of the EPs or any of the short plays. But nevertheless, Boy came out in 1980. So I would have been 6 years old at the time. And I can't say that I remember anything about that. However, there was one song that was on the radio. So I'd mentioned before that I would go and I would visit my dad. My parents were divorced. And my dad was listening to almost exclusively the rock and roll stations. And there were two stations, one that basically only played classic rock. So when we're talking about the late 70s, early 80s, even some bands that had been, relatively contemporary in the early part of the 70s and even the mid-70s were on these channels. So, of course, I'm talking about the Led Zeppelins, the Black Sabbaths, the Deep Purples, and, of course, Beatles, Stones, etc. And then the other channel would play kind of a mixture of current rock and roll as well as the classic rock and roll. So an all rock and roll format. I do clearly remember the song I Will Follow. And that's really just a tiny little glimmer in the back of my head. But they really hadn't made any kind of impact on me at that point. But, 6 years old, I kind of remember them being a thing. And maybe it wasn't even that I remember them at 6. It was that song had some lasting radio play. And then, of course, their next record was in 1981, and that was October. Gosh, I don't even initially remember October. And Gloria would have been the main track from that. I vaguely recall that being on the radio. I don't recall that even being much on the radio nowadays. And I don't even think it makes their Apple Essentials playlist. So then there was in my opinion, at least to the best of my recollection, their big breakout, which of course was War. And part of the reason that this stands out to me was because of a new burgeoning format called MTV. And of course, there were two videos. There was New Year's Day and Sunday Bloody Sunday. Now, Sunday Bloody Sunday, I think was also released on the live record, and that was the video that I recall. So there's this band playing at obviously a significant crowd. I don't know if that was, some kind of stadium show they were doing with other bands. I mean, I didn't do tons of research. As you guys know, I just kind of wing it and go for it based upon a topic that I'm interested in. But I clearly remember the performance and the energy of it and the harmonizing vocals from Edge. And this guy out in front, he's carrying a flag and he's just belting out in full voice. And it's clearly a serious song. But again, 1983, I'm 9. I'm like 9 years old. But I just remember the energy of the live show and the energy of the crowd. And Sunday Bloody Sunday, killer drums, right? So the rhythm section is locked in and tight. And I was like, this band is really cool. Juxtapose that with New Year's Day, which even today, and I know it's by design in the instrumentation, it would just send this weird shiver up my spine and like pit in the knot of my stomach. So I can't recall if there was some particular traumatizing event that happened with that as the background, or if it's simply the tone and the key, whatever. So I loved Sunday Bloody Sunday, but New Year's Day always kind of gave me the willies. But the point is, those early kind of very punk rocky, that punk rock feeling and vibe of U2 was appealing to young me. Even back then, just interesting how I would have picked up on something a little bit heavier, a little bit dissonant. I got it. I embraced it. But then came the era that I can only describe as the Bore Me to Tears era. And that, of course, is an album that I consistently forget when I think about their discography. And that's The Unforgettable Fire. Followed by The Joshua Tree. So Unforgettable Fire was 1984. The Joshua Tree was 1987. Followed by what is considered by many kind of a train wreck. A very big budget train wreck of an album and accompanying rockumentary that is Rattle Hum. This is 84, 87, and 88. So in The Unforgettable Fire, you have a couple of songs that have been consistently part of their playlists, as far as their set lists as a live performer. And that is A Pride in the Name of Love and Bad and MLK. So those three songs I think of. But none of those songs, I guess Pride, I remember being on the radio and thinking that was pretty good. But they were not a band that I was seeking out. So when you consider the time period that I've talked about in some of the earlier podcasts about when I was interested in music and beginning to purchase music, The Unforgettable Fire came out in 1984. I'm 10 years old. I'm beginning to have those early itches of my own for music. And a lot of that, as I mentioned, was a lot of pop music, until 86. And in 86 was that kind of hair metal explosion. But in 1987, the Joshua Tree, their big, huge breakthrough album, I could have cared less. Their whole look, what they seemingly represented, was in such contrast to what I was now listening to. The metal, the glam, starting to get into the early thrash. They were the antithesis of a rock band to me. They were the antithesis of rock stars to me. Yet here they are at their peak. And when I talk about peak, I don't even necessarily mean in purely artistic sense, although one could argue that the more number one hits that you have and the more units of an album that you sell can only be derived from something artistically great. But I think there are plenty of artistically great albums and artists that don't make it to number one or aren't fondly regarded until much later on or even after an artist has passed along. So those posthumous honors that you so often hear about. And then I am a freshman in high school when Rattle Hum comes out. That comes out in October of 88. And I had somewhere around that time just began dating my first serious high school girlfriend, who just so happened to be a huge U2 fan. I think I stalled and changed plans and did everything I could not to see Rattle Hum in the movie theater. I didn't want to go. And if I ended up going, we've kind of lost touch the last couple of years. I don't know if she's listening to the podcast. I don't think I ever really got dragged in. I don't think we did it. I feel like we maybe popped in and the theater was full. And then we went to the movie theater next door. This is back when you can, pop from movie theater if you didn't get caught, and ended up watching the Michael Moore documentary. Oh gosh. What is it? Roger and Me. We're like 14 years old watching Michael Moore's Roger and Me. I mean, the guy's a great documentarian. Doesn't matter what your opinion is one way or another, or your political affiliations or leanings. He's good at storytelling. And a couple of 14-year-olds got riveted by a documentary about Ford Motor Company. But Rattle Hum at the time was not something I wanted to listen to or watch, and even some of the songs that came out of it. So here's a band now that has sold millions of records, arguably one of the biggest bands in the world. And I don't even think it's arguable, because when you get to a certain point where you are filling out stadiums, much less arenas, stadiums, you really have reached a very significant point in pop culture. They were one of the biggest bands in the world. And I really think at the time, there were other bands in different genres. So it was like U2 and like Bon Jovi and like Def Leppard and, this rock sphere of these huge acts, as well as legendary acts or continuously legendary acts like the Genesis and stuff like that, where they were selling these huge venues. Post-Police Sting, I think. Trying to remember when they fully broke up the Police for the first time. But the point is, you got Edge with his long hair and his stupid little hat and his little Amish outfit, the button-up shirt and the suspenders. You got the young kid behind the drum kit with the kind of blonde, almost pompadour. And you got the lead singer who is, when you think about that time period, the long hair and the bandanas, and just seemed very pretentious. And then you got your bass player, your bespectacled guy who's just holding it all down. And from what everyone says, kind of the party boy of the group. Didn't fit with where I was at that point in my life and what I was interested in. So then, fast forward. So as I mentioned, so their discography, 1980 to 1981, so a year. 81, 83, 2 years. 83 to 84, a year. Joshua Tree. So from Unforgettable Fire to Joshua Tree, that's about 3 years. Then Rattle and Hum. So it goes 87, 88. So then even though it's, 3 years rounding, the longest time between records that they'd ever had was actually between Rattle and Hum and Achtung Baby. And reading a little bit about the background of the recording of that album, they almost broke up a number of times. And part of that was, there was this legitimate backlash. So Rattle and Hum was considered, while monetarily a huge success, the critics ravaged it, like absolutely ravaged it, both as an album and as a film. Partially because it was seemingly this pretentious attempt not even to memorialize the American roots of soul music and the Delta blues, etc. It almost seemed more like a, not truly exploitative, because I don't think that's fair. I do think that their heart was in the right place, and I do think that they had become much more interested in that. I would think as young men growing up in Ireland, they were probably much more influenced by things like The Who, for example. And certainly they've mentioned a number of times being influenced by bands like the Ramones and the Clash. So they weren't really trying to be exploitative, the B.B. King thing and, the big choir number. But certainly the perception had grown that here was a band that thought far too much of themselves, and what may have been earnest or had been perceived as earnest in the past was now seemingly less than sincere, which is interesting because they're living in an environment where party boys and lack of sincerity, just nothing but a good time, to paraphrase Poison, like that's what's going on in rock music, right? We're still far away, at least as a Rattle of Hum. We're a few years away from grunge and punk exploding all over again. So this is your competition, and you're the one being looked at as kind of like a little bit holier than thou and in direct contrast, which probably gave them very different fan bases, but you're looking to appeal to the greatest number of people possible. So when guys like me who are into rock music find you to be uninteresting or unappealing, you've already limited your potential audience, and critics were feeling the same way. So they go and they regroup, and they record in a bunch of different places. Berlin, during right after the wall had fallen, the Berlin Wall. Back to Ireland, a couple different locations, etc. And they almost broke up a number of times because of this backlash, because they didn't know who they were, what they were interested in. Now, what fascinates me is I just mentioned The Edge having an Amish look. So to think of that guy becoming very much interested in electronic music and dance music, techno, industrial, it's just mind-blowing. Like, how did he come across as me? Like, wow, I really get this scene. It appeals to me. One minute he's dressed like an Amish guy with a stupid hat. And now he switches one stupid hat for another stupid hat, and that becomes equally iconic as a look. I joke, of course, but kind of what happened. So they begin exploring these different things. And for the first time in the band's career, instead of just getting into a room and jamming, Edge and Bono are off doing their own thing. Now, if you're coming off of criticism that you're pretentious, the last thing you want to do is then alienate the other members of your band by kind of assuming control and, okay, we're going to dictate what direction the band goes in. However, when you have a tremendously talented rhythm section, solid if unspectacular, but I think Adam Clayton is actually a really, really good bass player. Like, really good bass player. If you're interested in dance music, R&B, industrial, etc., having a really great rhythm section matters. But Larry Mullen Jr. had questioned what his place was in the band because they could just go ahead and program a drum machine. Do you need him? There's something just very different about real organic drums that you just can't capture, and particularly his style. So I guess what I'm getting at is out in this other little world that they're in, this little vacuum that they're in, trying to rediscover themselves, independent of anything that's happening anywhere else in the world, because they're in semi-seclusion. Yes, they're listening to these things that, are in the local scenes. But way out in the United States, in the western part of the United States, a whole thing is brewing. You have this rap music explosion, which is oftentimes a DJ and programming. And you also have the earliest records, or some of the earlier records, or maybe more of the earlier breakthrough records of bands like Ministry and Nine Inch Nails. So these bunch of seemingly pseudo hippie folk, kind of used to be punk rockers with their scruffy look and all of that, somehow releases an album that fits so completely into everything else that was happening in music, while probably being a good 6, 7, 8 years older just as human beings, but also 10, 12 years deep into their actual careers. And they come out with what to me was the first time, truly, that I said, holy shit, where has this band been my whole life? What is all this other stuff you were doing that was boring and unappealing? And they dropped Achtung Baby in 1991, and it's the first U2 record that I purchased. First, I purchased it on cassette, and I later on purchased it on CD. Yes, I purchased it twice in multiple formats because it simply blew me away. So the first track off of that was Mysterious Ways. And that opening guitar lick, just so funky, and the beat, and just such great lyrics. And wow, this is pop. But instead of these jangly guitars that there was on these other songs, you have a heavier edge, pardon the pun. The vocals on the record, typically it's very clean, very beautiful. Sometimes some doubling of tracks. Doubling is when a singer is singing the same line but in two different octaves, gives it a much fuller sound. But now the vocals are through effects. The drums have triggers. And Edge, already known as someone who experiments greatly with all these different sounds, he's going off in other directions. And even Adam Clayton is playing through effects. And it just grabbed me. It just grabbed me. Now, what was so clever about it is for someone like me who had considered them a little pretentious, a little holier than thou, Bono adopts a character that completely leans in to all of that, leans into the pretentiousness, leans in to the rock star persona. And it's so seemingly tongue-in-cheek and satirical and pushing the envelope. And his interviews are in this character. So gone are these, pleading words on social commentary. Whether it's a song like Sunday Bloody Sunday and the Troubles in Ireland. Whatever it is, whatever was the current movement that he was interested in, now he was sarcastic. Now, they were always sarcastic, which was, by the way, part of the criticism of Rattle Hum was how distant and seemingly flippant and almost disrespectful to the interview questions, kind of making a mockery of it. Well, I mean, that was part of it. They definitely made it more difficult for those who were filming it. It was meant to be cheeky, probably their own little play on, some of the Beatles movies. But now the snark, like the pure snark, and I'm a rock star. Because that's what everyone was like, oh, this guy, look at him. Now he can embrace it. But here's the thing. And as we go further, we'll talk a little bit more about kind of this backlash. So as I started at the beginning, like this is a band that, you love or you hate to love or whatever it is. Once Bono put on those stupid shades, the problem is he never took them off. There might have been a different pair here and there, but once he stepped in and assumed this rock star role, it's almost like he never quite got back to that earnest, pleading singer that, while I will admit, like that time period, I just said that it was not something that appealed to me. But when I went back later on as a fan of their music and listened to it, and I realized that I had missed something, that was on me. I was turning my nose at it. It seemed so sincere in hindsight. That guy was gone. And I think briefly came back, and as we go through, a little bit of more of the discography, couldn't there have been a way to merge these different worlds? My wife is a huge U2 fan. And I say is, I don't know. We debate that all the time. How do we feel about this band? For a lot of different reasons. And she maintains, well, they're two different bands. There's everything before Achtung Baby and everything after. But I maintain they're like four different bands. Those early days, right? Boy, October, War, kind of punk, kind of underground, a little bit of an edge to them. Unforgettable Fire, Joshua Tree, Rattle Hum, Big Huge Peak, biggest band in the world, boring as shit. Achtung Baby, Europa, pop. So the 90s U2. 90s U2 is my thing. I mean, unashamed about it. Europa and pop did less for me overall, but still some great music, and more aligned with my personal tastes at the time, but also my palette had expanded so greatly at that point that I was really embracing this different direction. I mean, there's really not much for me to say about Zeropa. Coming out in 1993, at this point, I'm still living at home, because I kind of put things into perspective of pre-Boston and post-Boston in my own life. But songs like Numb, Lemon is so stupid, I love it. Stay, Far Away, So Close, again, I really enjoyed that era. And then pop. Discotheque. I mean, the description is, it's techno heavy. I mean, it sure is. It sure is. But it's really fun. So I try to keep things on the podcast relegated to a certain time period. Because when we look at Gen X as a whole, right? Gen X as a whole, the later parts of Gen X. I mean, going all the way out to, by some estimations, it'll say like 79, for example, right? So if you're talking about 1979, let's see, how would I put this? I mean, 97 would be kind of a cutoff, but usually a couple years after high school, you're still, in your late teens, early 20s. So I usually like to make a cutoff of about 1999. That makes sense to me as far as what's of most interest to people listening to the podcast. But I have to point out that then there was another era of U2. And that came from 2000. And that was the All You Can't Leave Behind record. Really, there's two albums in that era. It's All That You Can't Leave Behind and How to Dismantle an Atomic Bomb. Anything past that, I couldn't tell you. I think one of them was the one that caused all the backlash from Apple Music when everyone got it downloaded to their Apple Music, whether you wanted it or not. That certainly contributed to these negative feelings towards the band. I mean, definitely this latter era really is probably more negative than positive, even in critical reviews and album sales. Their last album, 2017, which I couldn't even tell you that it came out. I had no idea about this. I know that most people are purchasing things either via download, download, streaming, whatever. 180,000 physical copies. There are independent rappers right now who are moving more than 180,000 physical copies, which is just mind-blowing if you think about it. A band that is a diamond selling band, and like diamond is 10 million plus. And that's rarefied air, right? They're in that air. 180 physical copies. One of the biggest bands in the world. But All That You Can't Leave Behind is important because it was the record that came out. So I guess in 97, I was friends with my wife then. But 2000, we've already been together, a couple of years now dating. And it was the melding, like I said, of the old U2, that earnest time period, plus what they became, alternative rock, dance, techno, whatever, this big melting pot of music that they had become, but stripped down and just being a good rock band with everything that they've accumulated in their bag of tricks. So the only time that I've seen U2 in concert was the accompanying tour to this, which was the Elevation Tour. And I cannot remember which night that we went, but in June of 2001, my wife and I were at what was called at the time the Fleet Center in Boston, where they did, I don't know how many nights in a row. It's now called the TD Garden, by the way. But we were there, and unbeknownst to us, they were recording a live DVD. Tremendous concert. I mean, truly one of the singular greatest performances that I'd ever seen. Coupled with the fact that their opening act for that leg of the tour was none other than one of my other all-time favorites, Polly Jean Harvey. PJ Harvey and U2 at a huge arena show, coming off arguably their best record in years. Holy cow. Amazing. I actually, one of the few band shirts that I have, remaining, because all the stuff that I had when I was a kid and all those concerts, they were all torn up to shreds because I wore them all the time. I still have my Raglan style shirt. So that's the, 3/4 sleeve baseball style from the Elevation tour. So ridiculously good. And Beautiful Day is an iconic song. Truly an iconic song. And not too long after that concert was September 11th. And I have to say, there was no better, more appropriate band to play in the Super Bowl with a team that is called Boston's team, New England's team, the New England Patriots. But to have, Boston is such a connection and so rooted in U2's history. They played the Rathskeller, Ireland, Boston. They were the most appropriate band to play that halftime show. And to me, that was almost their last great peak. I mean, that was that final zenith for the band. Right? Or was that apex? Yeah, zenith. Nadir's the opposite. Anyway, that is kind of my synopsis of the emotional journey, the musical journey that I've taken with this band. So the way that I can look at it is love, hate. No, like, hate. Love, like, meh. Meh. So what I decided to do was just listen. Just listen to some U2. Try to clear my brain of anything extraneous. Anything that didn't matter. What they looked like. My perceptions of the individuals in the band at various times. Because when you strip all of it away, pick a band. I love Motley Crue. I love Motley Crue. By and large, terrible human beings. Everyone deserves and should seek redemption. And I think that at least a couple of them have attempted this. But you can go through the list of great icons, great musicians of our time. And we're going back. Frank Sinatra does not have the rosiest of histories. Still a legend. Still one of the best to ever do it. So U2 is a band that really hasn't had any of those kind of scandals behind them. It's just an air of pomposity that I think troubles people. So I just listened. And I thought the best way to do it is that I knew I wouldn't have time from when I conceived the idea of this episode of listening to their entire discography. And I can't say that I would necessarily have gotten as much out of it had I done that. So this is where technology is pretty useful, because you can go to someplace like Apple Music and choose U2 Essentials. And really that's going to be a combination of things. It's going to be chart placement originally. It's going to be downloads, number of different factors, purchases. And I just listened. So I mentioned that I sometimes forget about the Unforgettable Fire, right? So I'm driving, so I'm listening to it because that's how I best perceive music. As I said early on, out with the boys, driving around, there's something about it. I forget about the Unforgettable Fire, and then Bad comes on. And I feel myself so moved by that. It's just one of those songs that gets me. Same thing with a song like Running to Stand Still. So trying to place myself outside of all my own accumulated knowledge and feelings about the band I recalled that at their very best, they had a significant power to move you as a listener. Now, some of you may say, nope, still never got it, didn't do it for me. And that's okay. Everyone has their own different tastes. But I was listening to the musicianship, listening to that rhythm section, and the great, stellar bass work by Adam Clayton. Listening to the different eras and evolution of Edge as a guitar player, and how it really became something entirely his own. He sounds like no one else. And sometimes doesn't even sound like himself, unless you're really deconstructing it and you're really like, you're a true guitar player. I'm not. I know like 3 chords. And listening to Bono's voice. And on some of these more introspective and darker songs, you can tell that the man who is creating them was sincere, because there can be this pleading in his voice, a plaintiveness, I think is the word. It comes from somewhere deep and raw and real. Because when he's really full throat, full voice, just unloading, even something as simple as a "oh," right? You feel it. That's what makes a great artist. Doesn't matter if they're pretentious or not. Doesn't matter if they're pompous or not. It's that ability to connect and move you. And I certainly experienced that seeing them live. So here is my very unofficial, only as of this week, top 10 U2 songs, according to me, your host on the Stuck in the Middle podcast. Number 10. I still haven't found what I'm looking for. I don't think you can have a credible list if this song isn't on it. It's not going to be a bunch of B-sides and weirdo stuff. You know, my wife will tell you that her favorite song is Sweetest Thing. It's amazing. It's amazing. Wouldn't be on my list. But very quickly, before I get into the rest of it, I do have a couple of honorable mentions. Beautiful Day, as I mentioned earlier, is so good and such a return to glory, if you will, for the band. Everything about it is perfect, and it's really just a straightforward rock song. It really is. Tremendous. And then even better than The Real Thing from Achtung Baby. Just that. It's just great. It's just great stuff. So back to the list. Number 9, that first single from Achtung Baby, Mysterious Ways. It was the song that, for lack of a better easy for me to say, lack of a better term, converted me to someone who enjoyed this band. That song changed it for me. I went out and bought the record. Number 8, Bad, off the album I Always Forget. Bad is just, it's raw. It's a very raw song, but it also builds on a very simple little guitar riff from Edge. And it builds, it builds. It's truly, I think, one of their best works. So, number 7, that first video that I recall, that time where, hey, I kind of like them. Sunday, Bloody Sunday. So I talk about that vocal quality of Bono. it is on no greater display than Sunday Bloody Sunday. And that live version, which I think might have been at Red Rocks, right? Because they had a live record back then too. It is heartbreaking. Heartbreaking. And when you go to Rattle Hum and his stage rap with that, right? And he talks about a conflict in Northern Ireland that a majority of his people don't want. You realize in that moment, because there had just been a bombing, this is Ireland in the modern era. Now, I have a very, very Scandinavian last name. However, by lineage, I'm quite Irish and British. And I make the distinction because not all of Ireland, of course, is part of the UK. To think that this was continuing to happen into the 80s and the 90s, and the reason they call them the Troubles, it's really mind-blowing when you think about how long this conflict has been going on. But that pure pain and also anger in his voice is so evident. Number 6. That kind of song I think I maybe kind of remember from when I was 6. I Will Follow. I Will Follow. It's a good pop number. Like this, like just a good old fashioned Brit pop song. And it's just a lot of fun. Not a lot of substance. You don't need to. It's perfect. Maybe there's more to the song that I didn't realize or look into, and I'm not going to start now. Because bottom of line is just a great song. Number 5. Where the Streets Have No Name. So, I mentioned my wife being a big U2 fan. Now, she doesn't always have a chance to listen to the podcast. But any of the other family who listen to this. So my wife is from the Midwest. She's from Omaha, Nebraska. And there's a street there called State Street. And State Street is this like long kind of connecting road, but it's, so much of the Midwest is very, very flat. But this is kind of a hilly road, and you can really get some speed going before you even know it. When I think of Where the Streets Have No Name as it begins to build, because it's a really, for lack of a better term, a driving song. So again, getting in the car, driving. Where the Streets Have No Name is just one of those songs that all of a sudden you're going really fast. And imagining going down State Street with these bumps. I mean, you could leave pavement for a little bit if you hit it just right. That's what I think of when I think of Where the Streets Have No Name. Number 4. 1. I think this is a song that gets, like the rest of the band, maybe a little bit maligned. And I don't quite understand how. Because it's a beautifully bittersweet song. Lyrically, perfect. Did I ask too much? More than a lot? I mean, it's the phraseology, the structure. It is without a doubt, and the reason it's so high is that it was one of those other moments in listening to Achtung Baby. And obviously this was released as a single. That was, again, where was this band and that opening organ? It's one of those songs that I could listen to over and over again, even today. I was seeing, some things where people were talking about, well, they're just overplayed. They've been overplayed. Maybe, but I don't listen to radio. I listen to what I want, when I want, via streaming services. And this is a song that deserves to be in my opinion, on any best of list of the 90s. Or maybe even if you wanted to narrow it down between, 90 and 92 or 95 or whatever, it belongs there. It's a great, great song. Number 3, Running to Stand Still. This is particularly the live version. It is, I've already used the term, but heartbreaking, just truly heartbreaking. And there's a pain to it, an ache, not just pain. It's like an ache. And there's one line here. I'm always going to get it wrong if I don't read it. Yeah, here it is. You gotta cry without weeping, talk without speaking, scream without raising your voice. Something about the line, and if I had done it by memory, I would have mangled it. That is such an explanation of addiction and the horrors of addiction and how many people, not just young people, people of all ages, all walks of life, succumbing to what truly is a deadly disease. And this song, I think it just encapsulates it beautifully, considering that you have someone who, unlike many contemporaries of his time, probably never did a drug, at least not that I ever heard of. She is raging, and the storm blows up in her eyes. She will suffer the needle chill. She's running to stand still. Haunting and gorgeous. Number 2, With or Without You. Really? That high? Yeah, it's awesome. It's awesome. It is awesome. Amazing. Tremendous. Top notch. If this song does not make you go, whoa, 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 I don't know. Do you not sing along to Don't Stop Believing by Journey? Because if so, we can't be friends. With or Without You, freaking badass. Everything about it. And those woes. Full voice, full body, full chest. It's just, whoa. And it's real. And you can tell that it's real. It's a really great song. And if somehow you've lived under a rock for 40 years, or you simply, like myself, you too, that's not my cup of tea, and you haven't really listened to it, put on your headphones. Or if you're like me, because I'm deaf in one ear, so I can't hear in stereo. So I can't pick everything up unless I'm in my car, and then I can hear everything. Yeah, I still recommend that. Go get in your car. If you have a sunroof, put it down, and you get to that part, whoa, 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 and you just let it go. And guess what? Your day's going to be better. You're going to feel better, because everyone needs to just unleash some woes. And if you're not feeling that, just go listen to Living on a Prayer by Bon Jovi. It'll do the same thing for you. And number 1, Who's Gonna Ride Your Wild Horses? Now, some might say, well, that's kind of an odd pick, isn't it? Maybe. But that has always been the song that I've most identified with. And I think part of it does go back to when it came out. I had been in that age, an on again, off again relationship when this song came out. I'd already listened to the album, but then the accompanying music video. And, Bono didn't want to say certain words, right? He didn't want to say who's going to take the place of me, right? But then the "Don't Look Back" and that "Don't You Look Back," where he just opens himself up and releases just these powerful notes that seemingly come from such a true, deep place. That's a soul scream. That's a soul note. I've kind of neglected the rest of the band with some of this stuff. I kind of gave some shout outs to, the rhythm section. But I think that as a singer, because that's what I have done the most in my musical journeys, it's a musical journey. I just identify the most with that, and I listen to that the most. But I think I'm going to go back and listen to that song and pick it apart a little bit more closely as far as the musicianship goes. But I simply cannot, I can't overlook the great vocal performance on the song. It's truly sublime. So that is my deep dive, or not so deep dive, superficial, let's do this in 45 minutes to an hour dive into a band that's been around since 1980. What do you think? I've been asking questions on the podcast and asking questions on the various social media platforms because I'd love to hear your thoughts on these subjects. And even some family and friends, like sometimes I'm listening to the podcast, I find myself, yelling at the radio or whatever method and just saying, "Oh my gosh, I have a comment here or a comment there." Give me the comment. Put it on any of the platforms. Yes, even family. Go ahead and do that. That'll help spur conversation from others. Because it's great and it's so much fun to do. And I think you might have heard tonight a little psyched about this episode, just really jazzed about it because I just started digging into the discography and finding myself a little bit reawakened to the joys of U2. Now, that doesn't take away from the fact that Bono is insufferable. He is insufferable. So is Sting. You're going to tell me Synchronicity is an amazing frickin' record? Get out of here. Lots of guys can be insufferable and still have a tremendous artistic legacy. But what are your thoughts? U2, love them, hate them, one of the greatest bands of all time, one of the worst bands of all time? Or are they, paradoxically, both the best and worst band that's ever existed? And I will tell you, I am sure that there are other people like me who would consider themselves U2 fans who could say, probably honestly, at every given day, I love them and I hate them. That's just U2 in a nutshell. So I mentioned interacting with me. How do you do that? Well, you can follow me at Twitter, Instagram, or YouTube at StuckPodX, and Facebook at Stuck in the Middle, a Gen X podcast. You can email me at stuckinthemiddlepod@yahoo.com. And if you leave an email message for me with questions, comments, I might read your email on the air. Please leave 5-star reviews. And most importantly, don't forget to like and subscribe to the podcast. So, until next time, as always, later, slackers.